Very important subject of tax reform, and our two speakers are Phil English and Mac Zimmerman. I'd like to invite them both to come forward now. Phil English was a former congressman, well known to everyone in this room. He's been at many, if not all, of these Pennsylvania leadership conferences. Since leaving the House, he has been a senior government relations advisor at Arent Fox. He in Congress developed an interest and rich experience in trade, healthcare, and tax and energy. He serves as coordinator of the Healthcare Group Purchasing Industry Initiative, and most importantly for our discussion today, he is the honorary co-chair of the Center for Strategic Tax Reform and chairman of the Center for Strategic Tax Reform's Board of Advisors. Phil English, welcome. And Mac Zimmerman is the Vice President of Legislative Affairs at Americans for Prosperity, the nation's largest free market advocacy group. Before taking this position, he worked overseas in Asia. He has worked as a foreign election observer, a political consultant, a journalist, and an editor. You may have read him because he's appeared many times in the Investor's Business Daily and the Wall Street Journal. Please welcome both gentlemen for this discussion on tax reform. Thank you.
I'm going to let Matt go first because I'm still recovering from the shocking revelations about child bride practices in Chester County. Mac, this tax reform is fundamental and I believe is going to reshape the political landscape for years to come. On the personal side, let's talk about how the tax code has been changed in a way that will be very difficult for the left to roll back.
Sure, great, thank you. And of course, you all know Congressman English. I feel a little bit like Admiral James Stockdale right now. Who am I and why am I here? But the Congressman's right. There's some monumental changes to the tax code this year. I work for, as was mentioned, Americans for Prosperity. I'm a member of our lobbying team. And so I want to talk kind of a little bit this morning about some of those reforms on the personal side to the tax code, what AFP did as an organization in terms of engagement on helping to push those changes, why it matters, a little bit of a historical perspective on tax reform and some of the myths you often hear from the left in opposition to those kinds of changes, what we've already seen in the short few months after the tax reform bill was signed into law by President Trump, and sort of some the major features. The tax reform bill, rather than reducing the number of brackets, kept the 7 brackets. However, it reduced the rates for almost all of those brackets and widened the income bands to help flatten the tax code. And the result of this is going to be that about 90% of people in the U.S. will see a substantial tax cut going forward. Probably the most important feature, I think arguably, was also a doubling of the standard deduction. What that means is that the tax code will be more simple because the amount of money that people earned before it is subject to tax is sort of doubled across the board. 12,000 for individual filers, 18,000 for heads of household, and 24,000 for married filers. So that means you can earn more before you have to pay taxes, and it means fewer people will have to itemize. So that'll cut down on some of the really draconian compliance costs that we've seen under the previous tax code, which, by the way, this will be the last time this year that any of us have to file under that code. So that is certainly good news. Another important feature of the tax reform bill is that it lifts the limit for the widely hated alternative minimum tax and for the death tax, which increasingly we're sweeping in more and more people. So that will help ensure also that people keep more of what they earn. A couple of provisions of the tax code that are sort of interesting with the changes that were made at the end of last year that will also help a lot towards giving relief to some people at the lowest end of the income sphere are the repeal of the Obamacare individual mandate penalty As a lot of people in this room know, about 80% of the people who had to pay that fine or tax, depending on who you want to list, something that I think would have been quite unthinkable many years ago. But it was sort of I like to think of it as probably the least talked about, most consequential part of that bill, which in many ways didn't have very much to do with taxes at all, though we'll certainly see probably an increase in revenue as a result of it. Just as important as what was included in the bill is also what was not included. And this was sort of a big part of what we tried to do as an organization, was to make sure that new burdens weren't included in the code, things like new consumption taxes. We were happy that Congress sort of resisted the effort to do that and to sort of depoliticize the code. You know, about 90% of the turf war, when you're talking about tax changes in Congress, are different politicians trying to use the tax code to funnel benefits to certain politically connected special interests. And some of you have probably heard the term tax extenders. It's sort of a catch-all bill that Congress passes every few years to sort of funnel some of these tax benefits to some of those special interest groups that I'm talking about. And those kind of groups that have benefited in the past have been everyone from rum distillers to racehorse breeders to people who make TV and film productions. And, you know, traditionally those low-income folks that need a lot of help from Washington, like Hollywood producers. So the fact that those types of things were not included in the tax bill was just as important as what was included. And so we started our effort right after the election on engaging Congress to really push for changes to the code as an organization. Americans for Prosperity has around 3 million activists in all 50 states. We have active chapters in 36 states, one of which is Pennsylvania. And so we really work to mobilize our grassroots activists to put pressure on members of Congress to do the right thing, who might be recalcitrant, and also to let people know up there who are fighting for the right thing, who are maybe in tough districts, that we would have their back. So to that end, we conducted about 1,000 meetings on Capitol Hill over the course of last year. We did about 100 events, rallies, roundtables with members of Congress back in their districts during the August recess, when things really started to get difficult in Washington. And so to help reassure people that we were with them, as I'm sure you saw, a lot of people on the left were crashing those town hall meetings, trying to really put a lot of pressure on some of our champions. We also engaged members when they went back to their district offices. And there are too many of those meetings to count. And the reason that we did that was to make sure that we call it sort of our thank and spank strategy, you know, reassuring people who are on the right side and putting pressure on those who are sort of on the fence. But we try to make sure that they can't go to Washington to get away from their district, and that they can't go to their district to get away from Washington, by making sure that we have groups of people staying in touch with them all the time. And so that was sort of a multifaceted effort, in addition to some of the traditional stuff, you know, TV ads, digital ads, and things like that, to try to keep this issue on the front burner for the public. Now, why this was important and what was at stake. You know, the previous tax code, which, by the way, I'll tell a quick joke. You know, Arthur Brooks speaks a lot, and he always says it's good to tell a joke. So the joke is, what do death and taxes have in common, or don't have in common? And that is that Congress doesn't convene every year to try to make death worse, which they did with taxes up until this year. And so in 2017, we're happy that the joke wasn't applicable. But the previous code created a lot of problems. There are 60,000 pages of law in the previous tax code and 8 million words of regulation. And the amount of words of regulation and pages of law has actually doubled since 1985. So it was getting worse by orders of magnitude. The compliance costs added up to about $400 billion annually out of the pockets of Americans, having to pay in order to comply with this behemoth tax code that's getting worse. And they spent the equivalent of 8.9 billion hours working to comply with it. And that has increased by about 2 billion hours just since 2012. So, and the code has gotten so absurdly complex that it's actually counterproductive in some ways. I mentioned the death tax a little bit earlier. Under the previous code, the death and gift tax in the federal code collected about $20 billion in revenue. Americans who pay the tax spend about $19.6 billion in revenue to comply with this provision of law. So it's almost a no net gain type thing for the federal government. So these were some of the inefficiencies that were sapping productivity that we were trying to seek to streamline, to flatten and simplify. So that money, instead of going towards compliance in that time, is going towards economic growth and job creation. So, you know, you heard a lot about Armageddon and how the bill was going to be Armageddon. It was going to create deficits as far as the eye could see and just blow up the federal finances. This is simply put not true if you look at the historical perspective. Deficits are not growing in Washington because people are undertaxed. Deficits are growing in Washington because Congress continues to spend money beyond what they're collecting in revenue. And this isn't just a talking point. If you look at some of the prior tax reforms, the big three, the Kennedy tax cuts, the Reagan tax cuts, and the Bush tax cuts that Congressman English was influential in helping put into place in the last decade. If you look at the 10-year periods after those tax reforms were put into place, you actually see a substantial increase in the amount of revenue being collected by the federal government. After the Kennedy tax cuts, the federal government collected about $280 billion in additional revenue. After the Reagan tax cuts, it was $400 billion. And after the Bush tax cuts, it was $227 billion. And keep in mind, that's with the 2008 recession. So when you reduce taxes, you generate more economic growth, which generates more revenue. So, I mean, I always like to say, if you're on the left and you care more about having money to pay for things like, you know, transportation and infrastructure, education and stuff like that, you should be in favor of tax cuts, not in favor of tax hikes. I know the Tax Foundation has done some analysis, which is often better than CBO and the Joint Committee, who tend to view these things on a static basis and are often wrong, have projected that these tax cuts just signed into law could generate about $600 billion in new revenue. So you're talking about a transformational piece of legislation that could really restart the American economy. And when we talk about growth, I mean, if you look at those last three tax cuts, you also see substantial GDP and job growth. In the 5-year period after those last three large tax cuts, we've seen bumps in annual quarterly GDP growth that were pretty significant. 5.2% after the Kennedy tax cuts, 5% after the Reagan tax cuts, and 3% after the Bush tax cuts, again, even when you figure in the recession. So these are pretty big numbers, especially when you consider that folks at CBO and others were sort of poo-pooing the tax relief bill that just came forward this year and saying, yeah, well, you know, we have to get used to 1% growth because that's going to be sort of permanently how things work. And we've already seen that hasn't been the case. We also saw large increases in job growth, 9 million after the Kennedy tax cuts, 12 million after Reagan, 7 million after Bush. So I think it's safe to say that we'll probably see something similar going forward. Now, it's early to sort of score the Trump tax cuts, but we already have a couple of months to go on. And there's been some pretty big improvements already that we've seen. Just in the first 30 days after the signing, not talking about the last couple months, we saw the largest increase in hourly wages since 2009. We saw a $115 billion reduction in the amount of personal tax burden for the public in terms of withholding. And some of the biggest winners have been the middle class, despite some of the rhetoric, again, that you hear from the left, that this is all about, you know, corporations and the much maligned 1%. If you look outside that top 1%, everyone outside of that group pays about 60% of income taxes, but they will get about 80% of the benefits of this tax reform package. So they will disproportionately benefit from this, which is a good thing. A family of four making $73,000 a year is going to get about a $2,000 tax cut this year. And an individual worker who makes about $50,000 a year will see about $200 a month in additional money. So that's a substantial amount of money. I mean, some people probably think that's crumbs. I don't know. I think if you ask the person who's going to be taking home that $200, they may disagree. Some other encouraging signs that go beyond that 30 days. We saw 300,000 new jobs added in February. The most recent jobs report had another 100,000 being created. People are sort of poo-pooing that, saying it failed to meet expectations. Although I remember during the last administration when 100,000 new jobs in the report was looked at as kind of a bullish improvement in the economy. So perspective sort of changes, I guess, depending on who's kind of at the top. New jobless claims hit a 50-year low last month, which is incredible. I mean, 1969, you're going back a long ways. And then sort of one of the interesting stats I came across last month, which I try to call the take this job and shove it index, is the amount of job openings that are available for people to have choices to get new jobs if they don't like their current job. The number of job openings hit the highest level it's ever been at 6.3 million job openings last month. So things are looking very good. We have the lowest unemployment rate in 17 years. And last month, more Americans entered the workforce than at any time since 1983. So we've only had a few months to go on this. I think we can already see that that a lot of progress is being made, and we're just now moving forward into the new tax structure. So there are some risks. Before the tax cut bill's ink was even dry on the signature, we had some members of Congress in both parties that were talking about sort of trying to raise the gas tax, pulling about $400 billion out of the economy over 10 years, 25 cents a gallon, more than doubling what we currently pay. Fortunately, it looks as though that idea is dead for the moment, but we're going to continue to keep the pressure on. And of course, there's always pressure to bring back these special interest sort of tax giveaways that I talked about before. And so we're constantly being vigilant about that. At any rate, probably the largest threat is spending. There have been some speakers who talked about the omnibus spending bill that was just put into law. Obviously, more spending outstrips that new revenue that gets generated by tax reductions and will create pressure to raise taxes, which is something we really want to avoid. So members need to resist the urge to spend money faster than they can raise it.
So where does that leave us? First off, we're not going to stand between you and lunch, so we're going to wrap up relatively quickly. And in addition to my remarks, a quick invitation if anyone wants to ask a couple of specific questions that you can put on a card and provide to us, we would be delighted to do that. Mac has set the table beautifully for what happened on the individual side on tax reform. What is critical is where we go from here. We need to understand this is not going to be like 1986. 1986 was bipartisan, and 1986 established a fairly stable code for a period of time. We're not going to see that happen this time. Tax reform is going to be relitigated because the other side insisted on making this partisan. As a result, and to me, this came as an unpleasant surprise, but it required the moon and the stars to be in the right alignment for a Republican and conservative tax reform, albeit one of limited ambitions to go forward. It required us to have a Treasury where Steve Mnuchin, working with Gary Cohn, was supportive of what was going on in Congress. It required a Ways and Means Committee on the House side that brought their entire conference along with them. And that was extraordinary, and I will give a great deal of credit for the guy who has been the leading advocate of tax reform in that. Very narrow majority of the Senate working within the budget rules, and this is why certain compromises had to be made in order to get legislation through with only 51 votes. A lot of compromises had to be made, including making the personal side temporary for long-term budget purposes. That will be corrected. That's one of the reasons why we need to see tax reform continue to be engaged for the next couple of years. It required 4 leading Republicans on the Senate side to go out and negotiate within the Republican conference, which is very diverse, a solution and a common ground that would also pass the House. And one of those 4 was our own Pat Toomey, who did an extraordinary job. This is a tax package which will be sold in a different way than 1986, because it isn't just cutting rates. That may not be, individual rates may not be necessarily the most important thing in here. It's tax simplification by expanding the standard deduction. It's improving competitiveness, and it's also by stimulating economic growth. On the corporate side, there are important reasons why the tax reforms that were passed had to happen. The left won't acknowledge this, but ladies and gentlemen, we had the highest corporate taxes in the world, and no one was acknowledging that. I serve on the board of the Tax Foundation, And the Tax Foundation has done extraordinary work in this place, along with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The OECD had been consistently listing the United States as the second worst corporate tax climate. But the Tax Foundation, with their annual index, said that we were actually number 30 out of 35 surveyed, but on corporate tax rates, we were 35 out of 35. And what does that mean? This was a major contribution to the outflow of good-paying jobs to other jurisdictions and the erosion of our tax base in the United States. The tax base lost was directly related to jobs fleeing. And we now have a sustainable, by dropping the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21, what we've done is we've moved our corporate tax rate to roughly the average of the EU. So this is not a radical move. It's something that most of our competitors had already done. We were just catching up. And there's something else that's important in the tax package, and that is to improve incentives for investment in jobs. We included expensing. Unfortunately, temporary expensing, because not everyone was on board and because of those pesky budget rules. But long term, many of us would make the case for making an immediate write-off of capital investment a permanent part of the code. Why? Because it encourages manufacturers and other capital-intensive companies to put money back into the production line, back into jobs, and make the investment that allows American workers to be the most productive in the world. And that's very, very important. Also, we changed the way we do our international tax system by introducing the concept of territoriality. Now, I'm not going to stand up here with a green eye shade on. I will just tell you what I mean by that simply is where every other major competitor was taxing corporations and companies based on what was going on within their jurisdiction, we were taxing based on what they were doing globally, and then we were providing deferral. So we'd only tax them when they brought the money back. Big surprise, they weren't bringing the money back. As a result of putting in deemed repatriation and also changing the way we do business taxes on an international basis, we are bringing a flood of capital back into the United States to create jobs. That is extremely important for us to do. We didn't get it all done. We didn't get it all done. We should have fully repealed the death tax. We have an opportunity to do that and to bring that up in coming months. We should have fully repealed the AMT. We have an opportunity, I think, to do that. As Mac noted, we included a couple of things that were very important, like the repeal of the deductibility of state and local taxes, which was done in a limited way. But that change stops rewarding high tax states by subsidizing them with tax revenues from individuals from lower tax states. And all of those are fundamental rounds. The House Republicans and a growing number of senators have made a commitment to do round 2 on tax reform. We need to support them on that. As somebody who has served on the board of the Tax Foundation, I can tell you we have great opportunities to set the debate, to lock into place and support tax reform, which over the next few years will help revolutionize and reposition our economy. Couple of questions. We're out of time, but quickly. This is for you, Mac. The Pennsylvania branch of AFP did not support property tax elimination. Why not?
I work primarily on our federal lobbying efforts. I don't know if that is out here anywhere, but I would defer to her as the state director.
We'll all defer to her. Yeah. And we'll let whoever was interested chase them down. I want to thank all of you for the opportunity. Your messaging on tax reform and your support for the idea of continuing to bring this issue up is going to be absolutely critical. This is going to be a challenge to sell, but as we develop arguments that are slightly different from how we've sold tax reform in the past, I believe that we can make clear that this is an indispensable part of the American agenda in rebuilding our economy and growing our tax base and creating jobs that are going to last in states like Pennsylvania. Thank you all for your attention today.
Thank you, Phil and Mac. Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Let's give a round for all of our panelists this morning and individual speakers and candidates. All right, we have a break now. If you have not already checked out of your hotel, please do so now. Please vacate this room quickly because